Today's lecture is about resistance in architecture. Actually, the graph at the beginning of the lecture says all about what I intend to say. Although everybody thinks that resistance in architecture has been or is a new or a modern notion, it definitely started by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century with the arts and crafts movement, as it was moving against the mechanization and industrialization of architecture. One of the most celebrated cases of architecture as resistance, or what is known as critical architecture, was the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies in Barcelona. And then one of the most important advocates of resistance is, as you can see, the scar by Lewis Woods. We start first by introducing the concept of resistance. It has a Latin root that means holding back, standing against. This means that we cannot have a resistance unless we have an order, a standing order with norms, values, and we are trying to work either against it or to reflect critically on it. It originated in physics, yet it is definitely used in its political science.
Dr. Saleem?
Yes.
Yeah, can we please put it in the slideshow mode?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Opposition to an existing order. Its aim is to destabilize, but not destabilize to destroy, destabilize to shake and uncover. As such, it aims to create equilibrium. As resistance, it should start as pockets. It's definitely for the minority by the minority. Once resistance becomes a mainstream, it holds its resistance state and becomes a norm. It is not a social phenomenon. The basic question of resistance is to question the relationship between architecture production and so-called real world. I teach courses in criticism, and this is one of the really good quotes about criticism that definitely avoids evaluation and judgment. Criticism is a matter of correct distancing, to adopt a standpoint, to question, to doubt, to show how this apparently unitary world was in fact fragmentary and contested. Usually we oscillate between two states, or actually three states, a past, a present, and the future. I've put two quotations by two well-renowned authors. One talks about the future and one talks about the dilemma of the present. We belong to the future. We must put ourselves into it, each one at his situation. We must not plant ourselves in the present to retain a beautiful world that must perish. Nor must we try to build with creative fantasy a new one that claims to be immune to what's coming. We have to formulate the recent. Nevertheless, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that an old is dying. Nevertheless, a new cannot be born. In this, morbid symptoms appear. As architects, we are always torn between two images. An ideal past, usually associated with a classical kind of architecture, and a fluid computational future. In between, modernity appeared and dystopia rose its head. Before we start, I would like to say what I think about any architectural form. Architectural form has basically four components. A spatial component, i.e. where activities take place. And this spatial component is parametric and social, i.e. it houses activities and at the same time it reflects social and cultural norms. It has a structural component, which is pragmatic and instrumental, meaning it makes our building stand, and at the same time, it has the aesthetics of the tectonic, as Semper said, i.e. it is a part of an aesthetic realm that goes beyond the pragmatic. It has perceptual qualities, which makes it a part of a material culture via signs and symbols. And finally, it has an ordering part, which I call the conceptual, which is the workings of the intellect, as said by Vitruvius, Alberti, and many others. Usually, for us, time works in a linear way. There is a past, there is a present, and there is a future. Once we leave the past, we're in the present. Once so many changes take place in the present, due to, in architecture, for instance, mechanization and industrial production, i.e. the modern architecture had started in 1750. In such state of change, fragmentation, shock, let's say, architects usually have two solutions to runaway paths. They either reactivate history as a way forward to the future. They consult their history, either in forms, in principles, or in construction techniques. Any book about history of architecture would label these as romanticism, going back in order to find a solution to stabilize what has been destabilized. On the other hand, many others would embrace these developments. They would accept the changes and they would move forward. Either that movement is in two ways, either return to the unity of nature, creating organic forms as we would see, or by mechanization and engineering rationality, accepting the machine aesthetics. This branch of, or these movements, their school of thought, have been called futurists. Here I have several images that would depict going to the past, neoclassical, the neo-Gothic, embracing the changes, the Crystal Palace in 1851, the first resistant movement to whatever happened, which is the Red House by the arts and crafts movement, the unity with nature through Art Nouveau, Expressionism, the revolution about the present, which is the Russian constructivists, and the unity between arts and architecture in the Distil. Of course, the history of architecture continues. Villa Savoy, Falling Water, the house by Mies. Mies, international style, a reaction against the international style, a reaction against the reaction, which is deconstruction, and finally, from my readings, a turning point in the history of architecture, which is the Bilbao Museum by Gehry in 1987. And I will stop here, and then we'll come back to it later. Teaching my course, of course, we're talking about resistance and criticality. We cannot talk about resistance and criticality without talking about evolution. Evolution in architecture, evolution in movies, evolution in literature and philosophy. I found one of the most interesting images over the internet that talks about the development of industry, and at the same time, it symbolizes the development of architecture, moving from the mechanical assembly, engineering performance, to the performativity of the nanobots, the unity, the morphogenic. One of the things that I use in my lectures is associate architecture and development in architecture with movies. Of course, most of you know that this is the armor suit of Iron Man. When it first started in Iron Man 1 until it ended in the Endgame. What is most interesting in this development of the suit that it tracks the mechanization and modernization process in industry and in architecture, starting with the mechanical, refining the mechanical and assembly, its refinement, modifying the appearance, and moving towards the morphogenic, still in an assembly, the gene, development of the gene, until finally we reach the age of the nanobots. where the concept of performativity, the unity of all the functions of any artifact, are assembled together. This registers in such a way the development of architecture from the assembly up until the unity of the fabric. These images will better demonstrate what I'm talking about. This is the inside of a church within the Gothic architecture. This is inside the Oxford Museum, where the Gothic still maintained its element, yet it was expressed with the contemporary or modern materials at the time. This is, I think, in the 60s in the Czech Republic, the interior of a church. And finally, this is a parametricized or a computational generation of the Gothic. It definitely traces the development of the armor suit. Taking another look at Art Nouveau, this is the interior of the Horta Hotel by design. And these are parametric representations of the development of architecture. This development is linear, simple, anticipated. As technology, material, computation develop, definitely we have to move from the stone up to the immaterial. Before I start with resistance, I will take some time to elaborate on some terminologies that are very important that we face every day in criticism. And with that, we will face later in explaining what do you mean by resistance, criticality, and how it can be used in architecture. Architecture has always oscillated between two extreme polarities. On the one side, the architecture of autonomy, meaning that architecture is detached from, remember, this is an extreme. It's not an ideal situation. This is an extreme position. Architecture of autonomy deals with the architectural object and its formal operations, how it's been put together, how it's integrated and calibrated without any external reference, i.e., we are neutralizing the social, cultural, economical situations. Neutralizing, that does not mean that we do not acknowledge them, yet we keep them at a minimal, which means the architectural object is kept as self-referential. It is read in the relationship of its own formal system. It is not subordinate to political, economic, social, and technological events. One of the first theorists to call for that was actually Peter Eisenman in House 1 by the end of the 60s. The total disjunction of the discipline from society was cast a rejection of society's commodification by the end of the 60s as a form of resistance and critique. On the other pole, a completely opposite point of view, architecture as a cultural expression. In that sense, architecture is a reflection and expression of its society, of its context. Society, cultural factors, context, is the cause and content of the field form. It is dependent on them. There is a relationship of direct correspondence. Anything that does not conform to the cultural expectations is immediately rejected. Here, the weight of the architectural intention is slight in comparison to the regularity, budgetary, and social context it operates in. This is a call for an identity that resists the homogeneity inherent in modern society. Very crucial to the understanding of the concept of resistance in architecture. Please remember, now I'm trying to lay the foundation for whatever I'm going to say afterwards. All these words will become repetitive as we explain more. Is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. What do you mean when we say architecture is multidisciplinary? It means that buildings are intellectual structures that hold many systems together. They follow the needs and desires of the society. They are constructed from material provided by the market, guided via engineers, built according to the rules and regulations of a certain context. They enclose human behavior, and as such, Any work of architecture embraces knowledge, understanding, and modes of operation particular to a number of disciplines. In that sense, it is multidisciplinary. Now, interdisciplinary is a totally different term. Once we say architecture is interdisciplinary, we have to understand what interdisciplinary is. Usually it started in literature and research. Interdisciplinary means it questions the ideal apparatus that structures the discipline. Meaning that if we have a certain discipline, and you say that discipline is interdisciplinary, you're talking about questioning its dominant processes, thinking about its ideologies, meaning that you need not to maintain a status quo in that discipline. Rather, you're trying to generate resistant forms and modes of knowledge. You do not keep a status quo, you do not keep the present. You always seek transformation, a better understanding, a new understanding, or let's say a critical understanding. So if you use the term architecture as interdisciplinary, it's meaning that you're thinking about it critically, you're reflecting about it. Now, because architecture is multidisciplinary, once we use every discipline to create a check, to pressure the other disciplines, we are creating modes of operation that call into question everything that is normal in what we have. Three very important words in my readings that really affected the way I look at resistance, the spectacle. Spectacle is an event or scene regarded in terms of its visual impact, i.e. it means that I show something, I do something with the intention of attracting attention, with the wow factor. Commodification, the transformation of goods, services, ideas into commodities and objects of trade, which means everything has a tradable value. Tradable value. We're not talking about absolute values. Mostly we're talking about tradable values, which kind of lessens the absolute value of something. We're going to talk about theatricality. Theatricality in architecture is a term that was introduced by Samper, and it refers to the direct participation of architecture in the organization of rituals, usually to create religious mysteries, usually to create drama. It means that architecture creates a different reality that incorporates the 4Ds of architecture. By transforming the landscape, by being a theater, and here theatricality is being used in the positive sense, not in the negative sense, meaning architecture performs socially and culturally. It is not a passive backdrop. Actually, it is an active participant, and it creates a here and now. It makes possible an ideal, conceivable, a dreamed reality. These are all accepted canons in architecture. What do you mean by resistance? Resistance, we have a status quo of all what I've mentioned before. The normal evolution, the taken for granted norms, the terms, the terminologies, the conceptions. For Lebeswoods, the aim of resistance is to provide a space of speaking, to voice the others, that relieves you from the necessity to conform. From the start, resistance aims at being different. It cannot be universal. It's always particular. It responds to a specific place and time. As such, by the end of this lecture, you will not have a definite definition of resistance. I cannot give you a methodology. I cannot give you a method. I can only give you bits and pieces. And these bits and pieces can be assembled to create your own architecture of resistance, if ever, wherever you need. It's a hit-and-run architecture. It's supposed to hurt, intellectually, of course. Its goals are short-term, immediate. It aims to become a manifest, but it aims to fade away at the same time. That's because of its locality. When it's gone, it has a trace. It leaves its own trace. It works against external situations, such as politics, money, and culture. And at the same time, it works against itself, which means against the axioms and givens of a certain discipline. We have to distinguish between an avant-garde, like it happened in the architecture, like I presented before, which are the movements that project the future in time, and resistance. Avant-garde is not resistance. Avant-garde conforms with the majority, leads the majority. It cannot separate. Resistance counters the avant-garde. Not to say they're wrong, but to show aspects they did not pay attention to. It does not believe in the progress I've just shown you. It does not believe in addition. It is sudden, it is effective, and it always questions what has been accepted. It moves in a different direction. That's why, for Peter Eisenman, there is a distinction between a practice and a project. They cannot overlap. A project critiques the status quo of the discipline, and therefore it is ideological and political. It is a pursuit, while practice is only realizing a certain building. Now, projects resist and challenge. So resistance implies, when we talk about resistance in architecture, a clear distinction from a mode of architecture that opposes dominant economic and cultural stands and hints at an alternative form of practice that does not reproduce prevailing values. Critical architecture, it is our architecture of resistance. It is reflective and critical thinking. What do we think about and what do we need to reflect about? These are a number of images, if I may say, that we need to critically think about. They provoke us. And kindly remember, when I say think about critically, I'm not saying they're good or bad. We're not saying they're failures. We're not saying, please follow or do not follow. We're showing these images so that every time you saw an image, you immediately ask the question, why? Why did it happen in this way? How it happened this way? Some of these projects are realized. You can recognize the images in them, and some of them are purely theoretical. Some of them are meant as architectural stands and money generators. Some of them are meant as tests. Others are meant as conceptual architectures that show progress. Others satisfy a need to house, a need to show. Other images. All of these images, whether good or bad, and we're not, as I told you at the beginning, criticism is not about evaluating and judging. Criticism is about looking and questioning these images. These make us ponder. Once an architecture project is taken, is exaggerated, is excessive, it is intensified by the new material, the techniques, or the image. Architecture moves to become a purely visual and semiotic practice. Then it is accused of imitation, falsification, and commercialization. That's a question to resist. Spectacle is the primary manifestation of commodification or commercialization of design. A design that is intended to seduce, and we can substitute consumer by critics, users, students, investors, developers, administrators. We would like to seduce them to the spectacular, to the flashy, to the stimulating, to quickly experience gratification, just like you lure them to a television ad. This is called the commodity aesthetics. It distorts architectural tradition according to the rules of the market, and theatrically becomes that duplicates the aesthetics with the aim to lure. They call it fetishism, i.e. addiction to something that is unnecessary. In that process, the user is transformed to a consumer and spectator. You alienate, but not intellectually. You alienate socially in order to get something out of them. It is inauthentic, it is excessive and empty. And this definition was used in theater in the 17th or 18th century. Of course, most of the books that I've referenced in this lecture, they talk about the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao as the ultimate example of the beginning example of commodification and the spectacular in architecture. They're not talking about how great the architecture is or the theory behind it. They are talking about how that architecture was prostituted, intended to promote economic revitalization and lure in the tourist money in its work. A quick note about the spectacle in architecture. It went into the mainstream by the end of the 60s by a French philosopher, situationist, Guy Debord. They were talking about how people, starting by the end of the World War II, they were obsessed with images and appearances over reality, truth, and experience. There was a shift from having to appearing. We must have something to keep up appearances. We intend to have something not because it performs a certain function, rather because it will help us improve how we appear. Imagine this happening to a museum, happening to a graduation project, or being used by an architect to publicize himself. The spectacle focuses on appearance, focuses on image, with almost total negligence of reality, truth, and experience. Architecture became that. By the end of the 80s, and probably from 90s up until now, with the introduction of the computational and parametric, architecture became part of an experimentation, exploration of topological and computational geometry, robotic orchestration, production of materials, offering a new kind of experience and sensation, the effect of the visual effect, what they call the new baroque. And baroque, as an architectural trend, has a strange meaning. Besides the deformed pearl, it means unnecessary complexity, absurd complexity. Architecture has to be critical of what Harman said, overmining, undermining, and dual-mining. Architecture should not be reduced to a set of relationships, to only be understood as part of a greater whole. Relationships are not the only determinants of architecture. Undermining architecture should not be only reduced to a concept, to a sentence. It should not be reduced to a language. Architecture is about a totality, a performativity of some sort. These conditions of architecture call for a review. We have to find an alternative discourse. We have to resist, maybe as practitioners, maybe as academicians, maybe as professionals, whatever is happening in our world of architecture. And remember, I talk from a very normative stance, which means should or ought may not apply to everybody. That's being very critical. We have to go back to theory, but not the theory of the canon, architects should, but a theory of plurality, transdisciplinary, intellectual, and critical. That theory is a theory of reflection and renovation. It cuts deep. It comes about when we are forced a new self-consciousness of what we are doing. We cannot take whatever is happening for granted as evolution. We are, in our critical work, we should examine our work. The aim of theory is the examination of that work. Why do we need to resist? We're in a state of detachment. There is a lot of standardization and authoritarian urban context in the architecture of need. Lots of sprawl and spectacle. All the spotlights are on technical sophistication, surface differentiation, formal exhaustion, architectural imaging. That's what they call the Bilbao effect. With fetishizing form, the new digital techniques and the styles of construction. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not saying do not follow. It might be a personal stance. What I'm advocating here is looking critically at these in order to avoid the spectacle, to avoid commodification. The first two articles that talked about criticality in architecture was Kenneth Frampton in 1981 in his essay and then book in 83, Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Points of Architecture of Resistance. He was describing an architecture that resists, that expresses the tension between universal commodified culture and the regional types and languages. So the first call for resistance in architecture per se, in a formal essay or research, was by Kenneth Frampton to going back to the regional, to the power of the vernacular. With Ersing, the paradox, how to become modern and return to the sources, how to revive an old, dormant civilization and take part in universal culture. He was proposing an architecture of intermediate. How can you be both at the same time? Local character has to be interpreted in contemporary terms. What he proposed, an architecture that should resist the homogeneity inherent in modern society through expressing the locality. And remember, this is the first article in talking about criticality. The second, and this is the most referenced article in almost all the books that we're talking about criticality, post-criticality in architecture. It's Michael Hayes' Critical Architecture Between Culture and Form. It was written in 1984, I think. He was talking about the two polarities of architecture. He was talking about architecture as autonomy, as presented earlier, and architecture as a representation of culture. He was advocating an exceptional architecture that lies in between both. It is part of a cultural product, and at the same time is it discretely autonomous. Resistance describes how architecture might meaningfully interact with the global commodified culture without being dissolved by it. The presented case was about Mies. He was talking about Mies and the Barcelona Pavilion, and he argued about the possibility of a critical architecture that would operate the extremes of commodity and negative commentary. For them, critical thinking in architecture rejected disengagement. Any architecture of resistance should always engage the polarities. At the same time, it should reconcile these polarities. Confront, combine, expose. There is always a dialogue between dialectic materiality and liberal formalism. For him, and that's why he was talking about Mies, he was talking about the efficient representation of pre-existing cultural values, i.e. Barcelona, and at the same time, Mies's ability to develop the abstract formal system of the planes, vertical and horizontal. So an architecture of resistance, an architecture of criticality is an architecture that mediates, that oscillates, that moves between formal abstraction and material reality. Architecture is substance and act. It is a record of its intervention. Any critical architecture registers definitely its process of coming. And at the same time, it is a commentary on a situation, and it tracks an event where it happens. I'm going to show a small video about the Barcelona Pavilion. It was not prepared by me. Nevertheless, through its abstraction, it shows the development of the Barcelona Pavilion.
Please share the audio, please. Here.
In her analysis of the Barcelona Pavilion, Sofia Psara talked about how this project managed to operate in three paradigms at the same time. And that's why it is called one of the upmost representations or expressions about criticality. It managed to reflect the organic paradigm of Barcelona through the fluidity of its spaces. This is how you move. Mises' intention was to replicate how they move in the plazas and the streets of Barcelona, in creating vistas, in combining material, exposure, and it's in his manipulations of open and closed in one. He managed to capture what Sofia Psara called the classical model, i.e. the ordering of the whole design through the structure and through the interplay of the planes. And he managed to play with the modern paradigm through the materiality, through breaking the box, and through the contradictory expressions A column should be heavy in support. The column now is thin, light, and reflexive. Walls should enclose, they should hide. In his case, walls open up. Multiple views, multiple materials, and the feeling of what everybody calls, and this is one of the characteristics of resistance in architecture, the application of a twin phenomenon. Through my research, I found that there are several keywords that can be used to reflect resistance in architecture. One of them is architecture as an index. Index is different than a sign and a symbol. Index is self-explanatory. The design is an idea, a representation, and a construction at the same time. You do not need to resolve to culture. You do not need to consult an external code in order to understand it. The design is the register of its design process. There are traces of how it came about. There are traces of why it came about. Through understanding the design, you abstractly understand the conditions it produced. There is no direct relationship with any, yet through critical analysis, through visual and intellectual understanding of it, you can reach how it came about. Of course, the work of Le Corbusier in the 20s and 30s, plus the work of the New York Five in the late 60s is, or the late modern or neo-modern, is a direct example of the architecture of an index. The hybrid. You can resist by being a hybrid. And the hybrid is a term that has been used lately by Peter Eisenman. You do not use elements in their pure state. You use them in a compromising way. You accommodate rather than exclude. You prefer a both and rather than either or. It is an architecture of ambiguity. It is an architecture of complexity and contradiction. An architecture that hints at the classical, but it's not classical. It hints at modernity, yet it is not modernity, it is highly contemporary. So the ability to combine different elements to reflect different identities is called the hybrid. It reflects Sawyer,'s third place or third space. How can you be subjective and objective at the same time? How can you be abstract and concrete? How can you be real and imagined? This is called the hybrid. The difficult whole, a term that was used by Robin Venturi in Complexity and Contradiction, which is a compositional device that uses contradictory elements together, where you create transformative subspaces, you create a collage that holds two meanings at the same time. It works via the tools of superimposition and juxtaposition. If you look at the plan, it might be simple, yet the 3D might be very complex and vice versa. And of course, the scar by Lebes Woods. You do not mask whatever is ugly or distorted in the society. You keep it, you celebrate it as a reminder. People never heal. Architecture for Lebes Woods never heals either. I'm going to show now some examples of what I think are architectures of resistance of some sort, whether by Jones partners, Brian Cantley, Jones, Bernard Khoury in Lebanon, local student work, practitioners' work, simple work. I'm not going to comment about these. I'm just going to leave you to ponder upon them, think what of them is critical and what is not. Currently, people are talking about post-criticality. They're talking about not the critical, rather about the performative and the projective. There is no need to separate between theory and practice. Practice is theory. theory is practice. In practice, we test our axioms, our ideologies. And in that test, we transform them on the spot, we change them. In that sense, we practice what we say, and we say what we practice in real world and real time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Saleem. And it is indeed, a very interesting topic for participants and for myself as well. And, thank you for the introduction of the concept of architecture as resistance, and why do we need to resist. And my takeaway from the I'll share my takeaway in a few. We can just check on some of the comments from our participants. We have here from Shaxi Sai. Thank you for this very interesting lecture, Dr. Dahabreh. I am an English literature student, but I am venturing into design and structure for my PhD. Could you please suggest some reading materials on resistance architecture, please?
Yeah, that's easy. There is a very interesting book. It's called The Critical Architecture. It has a series of essays about criticality in architecture. There is another interesting book. It's called The Rent of Form. It's about the spectacle and commodification. A book called The Crisis of the Object. And the object and another book about this spectacle in architecture. I can provide you later with a list that you can use, definitely.
All right, so that's from Shaxi Sai. Okay, we have here from Alexander, if I may ask a question. When do we know when to use resistance? What social, political, economic context needs to be there to reach for a tool of architecture of resistance?
As mentioned earlier, resistance is actually an everyday practice. Every day we never take anything for granted as architects. There is always a how and a why. Whenever we see something that triggers us to ask a how and a why, and we do not find an answer to that question, either immediate or via analysis, that calls for resistance. Whenever there is a discontinuity, detachment between us, between ourselves, a group, a society or culture, and whatever is happening around, that calls for resistance. If ever we feel that we're too comfortable, as designers, of course, in whatever we're doing, it becomes too easy, too repetitive, that calls for an act of resistance in a certain way.
All right. I hope Alexander satisfied on that. Yes, thank you so much. Great lecture from Alexander. There's also a comment here from Muhammad Hussein. Great lecture, Dr. Saleem. Many thanks.
Thank you.
And then there is also from Hajar. Will the lecture be available? Yes, it will be available soon. Just we'll keep you posted on our follow our social media accounts at AIA Middle East. We have it on Facebook and Instagram and on YouTube. Now, are there any more questions from our participants? Mara says, I have great lecture, Dr. Saleem. It's very interesting topic.
Well, I'm really aware about the heaviness of the lecture. It's not really an easy topic. It's highly academic, and it's definitely it falls within the realm of deep theory. And what I found intriguing is that we've fallen so much from these topics these days that we need to go back to them. What was really strange to me or shocking to me is that I was trying to apply what I've read to create a framework and then look for some works in the Arabic world that would definitely reflect on architecture, on our current local architects. And unfortunately, I could not find it, either because I did not look too deep or because it does not exist in the actual theoretical sense it was mentioned in. And this intrigued me to maybe dig more into it theoretically and in investigating whatever is happening in real world architecture.
All right. Questions are flooding in now.
Yeah.
So yes, we have here from Aya. Can resistance be only in the form of structure, or it can be in material use too? For example, just materials used from form a resistance. So that's from Aya.
That's why when I first started the lecture, I said that architectural form has basically four components: the spatial, the conceptual, the corporeal, i.e., materiality, and the structural. Definitely, any part of these can be a tool, can be a media or a medium for resistance. For instance, when they talked about the Barcelona Pavilion, misused the materials contrary to their nature, which means he used very polished marble to the extent that it reflects. Columns which were supposed to be heavy and holding were very light and thin, and Mies did his best to show that the columns did not do their job. It was actually load-bearing walls, although it was actually supported on the columns. So definitely material manipulation, once it contradicts, it plays the role of a twin phenomena, and thus can be a great tool for resistance.
Yeah. All right. There's also a follow-up question from Alexander. What about aesthetic autonomy? Can we relate it to resistance? Should it be used?
Yes, autonomy in architecture, autonomy in general was referred to through the philosophy of Kant. He was talking about the three types of autonomy. The aesthetics of resistance, I call it the aesthetics of the grotesque. Usually when we talk about aesthetics, we refer to the ideal, the beautiful. We tend to ignore that the grotesque, and this was published in the Harvard Review, has its own beauty, its own allure. That's why sometimes you find people with a face tattoo. That's why sometimes you find scars interesting. Resistance is anything that would provoke you emotionally, mentally, and intellectually. So if you find beauty in a process, that is still very beautiful. That is a sort of a resistance. For instance, the beauty of the Smith House or the Douglas House, as I've analyzed them, is not actually in their final form. Rather, it's in their process on how Meier actually moved from its generic to the very specific form on it. So anything that would intrigue us, that would change our state of equilibrium, pushing us to reach a higher state of equilibrium, would be definitely called resistance, according to what I've read.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have here now from Dita. Thank you for the lecture. I'm working on PhD on topic of contestation of space in relation to fortification. Resistance can be seen also as the resisting response to an urban condition. What do you think on this matter? Dita Trisnawa, PhD in Indonesia, Universitas Indonesia.
Actually, that was one of the first places where resistance in architecture took place. It was in the bad and deteriorating urban conditions, in the forgotten, they call them the forgotten or unseen parts of the city. In urban design literature, there is a saying that and it was talking about Ireland, It said, do not ever shoot the graffiti guy. Just try to read what he's writing. So yes, when you have deteriorating urban conditions, forgotten, a minority, maybe ethnic, religious, gender of some sort, and it is being neglected, that's where pop resistance starts. And when Lebes Woods was talking about his resistance, he started thinking about when he was in Sarajevo and he visited the destroyed parts of the city, and they were discussing the rebuilding of these parts. And many said that you need to remind. You do not need to cover or mask or dress. You need to remind them of it, but yet provide for a better situation of some sort. So definitely resistance is, and there are actually many, if through a quick search over the internet, many resistance sculptures, pavilions are actually in forgotten urban conditions, urban plazas.
Okay, we'll go now to the Q&A tab. Okay, there's one here from Mara Ahmed. Great lecture, Dr. Saleem. This very interesting topic. Thank you, Mara. From Louis Alusain, I would like to ask about criticizing architecture. When does it become a social behavior and become a subject of influence from the public user? And a follow-up question, why Arab cities different greatly from the Western cities?
Well, if we talk about criticism, we have to differentiate between criticism as judgment and evaluation, and we have to look at criticism as more as of an investigative process to investigate what lies beneath rather than giving a grade or using an adjective of some sort. Number two, and this is all over, we have to differentiate between the doctrines of the layman and the doctrines of the academia, and then the doctrines of the practitioners, and then the doctrines of the professionals, and so on. In academia, we mostly talk about architecture. We try to look for how theory is reflected and expressed in the works of architecture. Is there a correspondence between the abstract, the philosophy, the theory, and then the final form of the project with a reference to a set of criteria, whether internal or external? Maybe a layman would be looking for maybe money, maybe a shelter, maybe the developer is looking for saving money, creating income, just in the case of Bilbao. The professional maybe is trying to experiment. So criticism is, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, is definitely subjected to a point of view that has a reference, that has how to say, a backbone of some sort. It is not for everybody, although not everybody may like it, because there is a huge difference between the act of criticism and the act of stating an opinion or a feeling. In criticism, we try to be as factual, as objective as possible, trying to negate as much as possible our own personal feelings about whatever is being said, and at the same time, trying not to, how do you say it? Actually trying to antagonize the forces, which is the audience or the designer, him or herself. But most importantly, we try to intellectualize, if I may use the term, whatever something seems mundane. Unfortunately, with the authority given to critics, whether via virtue of their certificates, their PhDs, or their expertise, sometimes whatever an authority says becomes a canon, becomes a criteria. X said this about this, so we take it for granted. And that's why the language where we use criticism becomes very important. I feel, I think, then this is, that makes a huge difference in architectural criticism. Yeah.
All right. I hope we have much time, but yeah, we will just get one more question or comment here from The last one is from Bisher. Should it be called architecture of resistance or rejection of the norm?
I think rejection is a very strong word,
A
because
strong word,
once you
yeah.
because rejection means that you refuse. Why? You refuse to acknowledge, you refuse to talk to. Resistance, on the other hand, and being critical, is about engagement. It's about acknowledgement. It's about having a dialogue between what you think or what I think, in order to come up with a constructed kind of a reality. Not everything is rejected. And actually, when I think Jonathan Hill in the book Critical Architecture, he was talking about, oh no, actually it was Lewis Woods. To resist something is to always have it as your twin. You're for instance, you're anti-deconstruction. So you have to always define yourself with deconstruction in a certain way. You are you're anti-modernist. So you cannot define yourself without defining the other. And that's why rejection means abolishing, eliminating the other, while resistance is acknowledging, adding to, or taking from that otherness. That's why they call it actually the twin phenomena. In most of the projects that we've shown, whether it's the hybrid, whether it's the scar or a difficult whole, there are always two contradictory, seemingly contradictory. Their combination together creates a positiveness of some sort.
All right. Okay. So yes, that concludes now the presentation of Dr. Saleem. Again, Dr. Saleem, thank you so much for your time and opportunity to present here at AIA Middle East.
I thank you very much. I'm very proud to be here. Thank you.
And for our participants and those who, of our colleagues who didn't make it, it will be rerun again very soon. Just keep eye on our social media account on our website. That's www.aiamiddleeast.org, or our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, AIA Middle East. Once again, thank you so much,
Thank you
Dr.
very much,
Saleem. And
wish you all a happy evening. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Keep safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.